Hi everyone, Frank Spangler here for Learning Media Skills. And in today's lesson, we're going to talk all about frame rates and especially how you can work with different types of frame rates on the same timeline in Edius, one of my favorite video editing software programs. Let's get started. So these days, with COVID-19 and all of the travel restrictions that go along with it, as a producer, I'm finding that these days I'm working on a lot of projects that have media coming in from all over the world. And as a result, the media in any given project has a variety of different frame rates. Some of the media can be at film rate. Some could be at PAL, 25 frames per second. A lot of them are at NTSC, 29.97, and some are at 59.94. And all of a sudden, you're having to work on one project, on one timeline, with all of these different types of frame rates. To compound the matter, some of the phone footage that comes in these days may not have a standard frame rate at all. The same phone can produce a different frame rate for each different clip. These different frame rates can introduce what's called frame blending. Now, Edius is very good at conforming different frame rates on the same timeline. That's kind of their motto, edit anything. And it's true, you can throw almost anything on an Edius timeline and it will conform it in the background and let you edit it and export it. However, when you just throw the media on the timeline without taking a close look at it or doing anything to improve it, what can happen is you can introduce these frame blending artifacts. And a lot of people not knowing that there is some things that you can do to help this along will just end up exporting these projects with these frame blending issues. And so today I want to have you kind of sit over my shoulder again and show you some tricks that you can do to make your footage look just a little bit better when you're working with all of these multiple frame rates. Last week I just ended up editing a project that had frame rates all over the board. Footage was coming in from Africa, from Asia, from the UK, and some of my own stock footage from the internet. What I had to do is decide, okay, as I look over this footage, what is most of it shot at? And that's the frame rate that I chose for the project itself. So the less you have to conform, the less problems that you might have to try and fix. So I went with 29.97, standard for Canada. At least it used to be back in the day. That's NTSC, right? And then a lot of the footage worked at that rate. It was that rate. But then what to do with all of the other footage? Let's take a look. All right, let's open up our project here called Together. And it's basically done. I am just waiting on a little bit more media from the client. But we've got a pretty complete timeline here with lots of examples to show you of how I work with these multiple frame rates. So it's a good project to use as our sample for our lesson. And I think the first thing that I'll do is duplicate this sequence so that as I show you things, I'm not going to do any damage to the actual live project here. And just in case you've never done that before, I'll show you how to duplicate a sequence. Normally, I keep my sequences all together in one folder. I noticed that I forgot to drag it in here. But that's okay. What you can always do if your sequence is lost in one of the other folders and you don't want to take the time to start rooting it out, what you can always do is just grab the sequence itself, just click on the tab there, and drag it on over to the sequence bin or whatever bin you want to drag it into. And there it is. It's intact. It's something that we can now duplicate. So how you do that, you just right click on the sequence itself and go to duplicate sequence. And now we have together -1. So now we just double click on that and it brings it down to the timeline, and we can rename it so there's no confusion. Maybe we'll say together for learning media skills. So now I will always know that I'm working in a timeline that no matter what damage I might do to it in this lesson, it's okay because I've got the original over here. First of all, just to confirm our project settings, let's go up to Settings and go down to Project Settings and confirm over here what we're working with. It is a HD project and it has been set to 29.97 as a frame rate. So let's hit OK. Now, while we're here looking at this, maybe something I should point out about Edius is that Edius does allow you to change some project settings in the middle of a project. For example, we could change this by going down to change current settings, and you'll be presented with the options that Edius will allow. Some things it will not allow you to do. For example, we cannot at this point change it to a film rate, 23.97. What we could do, though, if we wanted to, is bump this up to a 4K project. That's not usually something I would do, move from HD to 4K, but often I'll be editing a 4K project and decide at some point, I want to manipulate my media more than I thought I was going to. I'm going to change this to an HD project, and it'll allow me to do that. You can go from 4K to a HD project, but you have to either retain the original 29.9 progressive as a frame rate or double up on it. Or if your project was a 4K project at 59.94, you could cut that right in half and make it an HD project of 29.97p. Edius will allow you to do that. It just doesn't want you to move from NTSC to PEL in the middle of a project, or NTSC to film rate, or say you're working on a film rate project, it won't let you go up to NTSC or even PEL. So just be aware that Edius does have some of these types of restrictions. If you do need to change your end product, say you've done a whole project at film rate, but your client needs it in NTSC or PEL, there are ways of doing that, and we'll show you that in a separate lesson. But for today's project, we're just going to concentrate on one project setting, but the media coming in at many different frame rates and how we can work best with that. For the most part, Edius will do a pretty good job of conforming your odd frame rate to the project frame rate. If there isn't a lot of motion in the shot, you'll be fine. But if there is motion, you're going to start to see frame blending happening, because frame blending is the default method that Edius uses to conform the frame rate of your media to the project setting. And by the way, if you're not sure what the frame rate is of the media that you're working with, there's an easy way to discover that with Edius. You just, let me expand the timeline here. You just right-click on the clip that you're wondering about and go down to Properties, and then the dialog box that pops up will show you the frame rate and other information about it. And it looks like this particular clip is at 29.97, so there's no problem. I don't have to worry about this clip. Let's move on and see what else we've got here. A lot of this is stock footage, and so it can be all over the board depending on who shot it and what country and what settings they had. Okay, so this one was shot at film rate. A lot of guys that submit media to stock houses will shoot in film rate. So this is being automatically conformed by Edius to look as best it can in at 29.97. It's doing it in the background. If For the most part, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But if, as you observe it, you see some strange things going on, then you might want to try a few things to clean it up. Let's just cancel out of this and take a look at the clip itself and see if there's any problems. Okay, so this particular clip is fine. We don't have to worry about it. Even though it was shot at film rate, wasn't a lot of movement in the clip, it conforms very nicely automatically in the background. Let's see what else we've got here. A lot of these are fine. I know that I shot them, and most of my footage was shot in NTSC, so not a problem. I believe I was filming at film rate for this particular project. Let's check that. Yeah, it was at film rate. So here's one I would want to stop and take a look at. I can see right away there's not a lot of motion in it, and so it seems to be conforming quite well.
Here are some examples of how ADRA is helping people live better lives.
Well, my eyes catch a little bit of a problem, but it's not too bad to be worried about. Some of the problems that you might notice can have a lot to do with the actual camera that it was shot with, and the compression rate that camera was using, and the codecs that it was using. So some are going to conform better than others. Okay, we are getting into some footage here that I know I had to work with. I remember having to clean this up. What we're seeing here, I've actually already worked with it. We need to go to find the original footage, and I think I have it over here. Yes. All right, so this footage was submitted by the client. Let's take a look at it. Right-click on it, Properties, and notice it's HEVC and 29.87, and that's very telling that it was probably shot on an iPhone. And even though it's not that much different, it can still cause Edius to start introducing what I call blending artifacts. Let's see if we can notice any here. Well, because it's that HEVC footage, Edius doesn't even want to play it in real time. Oh yeah, and some of this footage had some strange stuff going on, and I'm not sure exactly what this is. I know he's got an iPhone 11 Pro Max, and so the quality should be good, but we've got some crazy looking artifacts here. Because it's random, not always in the same spot, I think, I'm only guessing here, but I think it is Edius struggling to make to conform it to the project setting that might be causing this. Because as I experimented with it and worked with it, I found that if I was, for example, to do an in and out here of this clip, and just export that clip to, say, an Edius codec, let's just do that. Let's go and use Grass Valley. Let's use the HQX and export it, and we'll use the super fine settings here and sample and hit save. And with Edius 10, Edius no longer automatically drops that into your bin for you. So you have to double click on your job monitor. We go in and we right click on the media that was just exported and select add to bin, and now it comes to our bin. And now, since it's been exported to Grass Valley codecs, it's nice and clean. The phone is automatically making some exposure adjustments, but we no longer have the bad artifacts that were in it. As we go through it slowly, we just don't find anything. And now, instead of being in that HEVC codec, it's now in a wonderful Grass Valley codec. It's going to be a lot easier to edit with. So what I did, let's take a look at some of these other clips. And this one, for example, HEVC 30.01 as a frame rate. I don't know why iPhones do this. But since these don't have a lot of motion in them, I don't see the frame blending problem that I'm talking about. Okay, here's one with some motion. Let's take a look at the frame rate here. It's at 30.1. Now, even though there's not a lot of difference between 29.97 and 30.01, if we were to examine this clip with a little bit of motion here quite carefully, we'd notice some frame blending. You know, it's not that severe, but it's still there, and we want to try and clean that up. Plus, it's still having some of these problem artifacts where I'm not sure what's causing it. So if you've got some phone footage that you need to clean up, well, here's what we do. And by the way, this actually isn't too bad. I've had to work with some phone footage from some very cheap smartphones. You know, we get footage in from the field from Myanmar and Thailand and China, and using very cheap phones that have strange codecs, and so phone footage can be a problem, much more than what we're seeing here. And so if you're having to deal with some of that, my recommendation is to bring it into the timeline that you're going to be working with, and do a couple of things. The first thing that I would do is see if I can clean up the video a little bit. So I'm going to go after my primary color correction filter, drop it on, and then go down to the information palette, double click on that, and it brings our wonderful color correction tools to the forefront, and we can start working with this. And often what I'll do at the same time when I'm working with this primary color correction tool is I will go over to grab my video scopes under the View menu tab there and change it to waveform. And this gives me a graphic demonstration of how much more I can bring it down so I can get the blacks looking black. And then we see that the lights are already too high. And if we were to try and bring those up more, we're going to start making the leaves look too white. Ideally, we want our whites to be falling somewhere around the 65 to 75 range. But for this particular clip shot with the camera phone, that's not going to work. Visually, we can tell that that's just not going to work. So let's bring it back. Probably about the only thing that we can do is go down and work with our curves. And for dark faces like this, we can lighten those up by taking the bottom curve there and just lifting that up, and that reduces the amount of contrast that you're seeing there and just kind of evens everything out. Might want to just bounce this one, the mid-tones up and down a little bit to see if you can get it a little better, and when you're happy, you'll hit OK. And then the next thing that I would do would be to right-click on the clip itself, go to Time Effect, and the option that you want to go for in the side menu here is Field Option. And by default, Edius will choose Frame Blending, and that's why you will see frame blending happening by default when Edius is trying to conform a piece of media to the project setting frame rate. It's doing it through a frame blending process. And some people like that look because it kind of gives a feel of motion, as though it was film rate, perhaps. I don't know. But I prefer using optical flow for the most part. But sometimes you should know that setting this to optical flow will introduce new problems to some clips that are even worse than the frame blending. So you have to check it after you hit OK and make sure that it looks better than it did before. Usually, I would say about 90% of the time, optical flow will look better. It will make it more like a progressive clip should look, and not introduce those frame blending artifacts. So now, as we go through here, we see that each frame is cleaner because we have changed it to optical flow. So that's what I did with each one of these clips. I went in, I used my primary color correction tool and made each clip look as good as possible. And then I went and did the right click and chose the field option and changed frame blending to optical flow. And then I just grouped all the clips together and exported it all as one long clip in a Grass Valley codec. And that's what we have over here in the final edit. A Grass Valley HQX file here, now at 29.97, that's been color corrected and changed to optical flow. And so now it looks a lot better. We have no more of those strange looking artifacts that could end up in the export if you're not careful. And so that's how I dealt with that iPhone footage. Now this footage here was shot with a Canon C200 using the RAW format at film rate. And so as she picks her tea, I believe there was some motion artifacts there. So what I did was right-clicked and went down to the time effect, field options, and I changed it to optical flow. Now, it still has what some might think is frame blending, but really all it is blur because we're shooting at such a low frame rate, the film rate. So as we play it now, even though we've changed it to the optical flow, as you play it frame by frame, you're going to see the motion blur. But again, that's not the frame blending that becomes a problem on an Edius timeline. It's just because it was shot at film rate, which is a really slow shutter speed, and causes this type of blur, which a lot of people prefer. But there's a big difference between motion blur and frame blending. All right, I had to put you on pause there, but here we are a day later, and I have received the final clips from the client to finish off this project, so let's take a look at them. Actually, I've already taken a look at them. They're not too bad. They were filmed with a decent camera. I'm guessing some type of current model DSLR. Let's take a look at the properties here and see what we're working with. Well, this one says 29.97 progressive, so we should be okay. Shouldn't have any worries with frame blending. The biggest problem that I found with the footage that the client provided was that it was obviously shot by someone who's kind of new to videoing. And so it was difficult to find spots that I could actually use for a good quality edit. I think I found something right in about here, but it just wasn't long enough, so I had to put it into slow-mo. Let's try this again. Take about that much of it. And since we won't be using the ambient audio because we're going to have to slow-mo it, I'll just click off the A here, so all I'm getting is the video when I drag it down. To put something into slow-mo, just right-click on it, go to time effect, choose speed, and we'll put this maybe at 40%. And because it is coming from a fairly decent camera, it should hold up well. Now, whenever you put a clip into slow motion like this, you can also introduce frame blending issues. Even though this clip was shot at the same frame rate as the project setting is, since we've now put it into slow motion, frame blending can happen as Edius tries to conform the new slow motion clip to the project setting of the timeline. And so as we take a look at it, we see that indeed we have a little bit of frame blending going on here. And so once again, I will go to our field options and choose optical flow in order to kind of clean this clip up. We like the slow motion here, or we had to do it in this case because there just wasn't enough media to cover my hole. And so we're having to work with a frame blending issue in the slow motion clip as well. Now, because this was high quality, not shot from a phone, I didn't find that I had to export it into Grass Valley codec before using it. I found it was no problem just to drop it on the timeline and work with it as a native clip. Let's see if we can't improve on the quality of the video. Grab our primary color correction filter, drop it on, And we've got the woman on the left is already down at 0, so I don't know if we'll try and bring it down much more. Let's see what happens if we bring up the gain. You notice that some of it is going right up past 100. That's the bright window over here, and that's okay. We're more concerned about flesh tones not going much over 75. But in this case, because of the dark faces, it's okay to go up just a little bit because we want to brighten up these faces just a little bit. Let's see what we can do with the curves. Well, that makes the walls just a little bright. Let's see if we can lift up the bottom node there and just reduce the contrast a little bit and open up those faces. All right, here's the next clip, and as I just skim through it, I can see that there's some issues with frame blending. So let's take a look at it and open up properties. Well, this one's filmed at film rate, which I find surprising. I thought all of this footage was coming from the same photographer, shot on the same day with the same camera, and that could be causing some of our blending problem here. Some of the blur is going to be motion blur, but it's also going to be, Edius is going to be blending these frames together as it tries to interpolate between the frame rate that it was shot at, film rate, and NTSC, which is our project rate. And so to make that move from 23.98 to 29.97, it's adding some frames, and by default, Edius uses that frame blending method. And so that's why we're seeing some problems and issues here. Let's close out of here, right-click on it, and change it to field options of optical flow and see if that helps. Yeah, right away I can see that looks a lot better. And so now we can just try and brighten it up a little bit. Because it was shot with a fairly decent camera, you can really add a lot to it without degrading it. Let's see what happens if we bring this up a little bit. Well, that's so much better. All right, so there you have it. If you are experiencing some frame blending issues, oftentimes, or a great majority of the times, just changing that to optical flow will solve a multitude of problems. And not always, like I say, works about 90% of the time, but there are some cases where it can introduce more problems than it solves. And maybe I should show you a sample of that. I think I've got one here from a previous edit where I ran into problems with optical flow. Here is a young girl in Myanmar showing off her dancing abilities. And I believe I shot this at NTSC. Yes, 29.97. So natively, the clip doesn't look that bad. But I wanted to use it as a closing shot and put it into slow motion with some nice music. And when I did that, let's just add some slow motion here. Go to time effect, speed. We'll change the percentage to 40%. This is the clip with just the native frame blending that Edius does. But I thought, maybe we can make this look a little better by using optical flow. So I changed this to optical flow. And by the way, I should point out that there, in Edius 9 and 10, they've added not just optical flow, but various levels of optical flow. And the higher the quality that you choose here, the longer it'll take to render. But let's maybe just, rather than take the default one of high speed, medium qualities might improve how optical flow works. Let's hit OK. Now, at first glance, it might say, yeah, this is better. But notice what happens to her hands. You can see that Edius is adding other distortions to them that when you render this out don't look very good at all. And so you have to make a quality control call as to which you prefer, to have these distortions in your shot or to have the frame blending. those kinds of distortions that you can see above her hand there look really bad when rendered out. People wonder, what on earth is that? This is new. This is different. And so as a judgment call, you just have to decide whether you're going to live with the frame blending or introduce this crazy new look that optical flow is giving to this fast motion. Now, had I shot this at a higher frame rate, like 60 or 120, that some of the new cameras offer, I wouldn't have this problem. But because it was shot at 29.97, this is what I'm going to have to deal with when trying to turn this into a slow motion shot. So if you know while you're out there shooting that this is probably going to be a good slow motion shot, be sure and change the frame rate of your camera for that particular shot. All right, well, that's all I wanted to share with you today. Hopefully you found it helpful. If so, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't done so yet, by all means, subscribe for more videos like this on Edius and how to do better media. We'll catch you down the road.